Hello and welcome to another episode of A Conversation with Carl. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe for the latest content. Public transportation is a vital lifeline for millions who don't rely on automobiles. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Jarrett Walker, a renowned American public transit consultant and author. Jarrett has shaped transit networks across North America and Europe. He's also the creator of the popular blog Human Transit and author of the acclaimed book of the same name. Welcome, Jarrett Walker, to the conversation.
Thanks very much, Carl. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining this. So let's start with the U.S. is lauded worldwide for many achievements, but public transit is rarely one of them. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, why do we lag behind?
Yes, that is a fair assessment, and it's because of the way the United States was built and the role that government and industry played working together in encouraging dependence on cars. One of the important things to start with here is that the American people did not choose car dependence while Europeans chose something else. The American people were sold car dependence through a collaboration of government and industry throughout the mid-20th century. And if you're interested in that story, I strongly recommend Peter Norton's book, Fighting Traffic, which really tells that story. So there was a decision, and it was very much a big government decision to do things like build the interstate highway system, and in particular, run interstate highways through the centers of cities in a way that other countries mostly did not do. And in order to make cars the primary way of getting around. It was all very, very much intentional. It was all very constructed. Now we have this situation that while car dependence works fine for a lot of people, and a lot of people have even built their identities around it, dense cities do not function if everyone is in their own car. It is in the nature, it is the very definition of a city that it's lots of people living close together, which means that there's not much space per person, which means there isn't room for everyone to take that much space. And so it's really in cities that public transit is most urgently needed in the U.S., although it has an important rural and small city role as well. And that's where we are up against a whole range of other than cultural and institutional challenges associated with needing this thing, but also being limited by American policies that, for example, make it hard for us to buy European or Asian technologies that are usually the best because they do so much. Because Europe and Asia do so much more innovation on the technological side than we do, understandably, because it's just more important to them.
So for someone who lives in New York City, and if I'm going to the airport, it costs me $100 to get there and $100 to get back. So that's $200, and it's probably on the cheap end. And I keep hearing this all the time. They want to build a train that goes to the airports, but they just don't get why they're having such trouble doing this.
Well, it doesn't cost me $100 to get to the airport in New York because I allow the time to get there on public transit as it is, and that has some frustrations to it. Certainly, the airport trains and their fares are irritating. It's irritating that you don't have a direct train to each of the airport terminals, as many cities do, but many cities don't. It's also the fact that one of your airports is only reachable by bus, but it's a perfectly good bus service, and if you don't mind using buses, it's fine. In fact, it is in many ways much easier to get to LaGuardia from Manhattan than it is to JFK or Newark, just because it's so close and you have to get there on a bus, but the buses are good and everything is being done to improve them. The M60, there you go.
Yeah.
Whole range of buses, including a shuttle bus from the nearest station for people coming from Queens.
Why do few legacy cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco have extensive transit networks, while the rest of the country generally has mediocre systems, I would say?
Well, you hit the key point with the word legacy. Remember, the car was invented and around 1900, popularized in the early 19th century. Cities that are older than that were built around public transit. And the explosive period of urban growth in the 1800s was almost entirely oriented around public transit. Developers built rail lines into the suburbs so that they could build suburbs around them. Land use and transport and public transit was integrated in that way. So the result was patterns of development that are very efficient for public transit to serve, because in many cases, the development and the transit were designed together. Now, And then we had, of course, almost a century of total planning around cars, total abandonment of that, which has built many of our newer cities in forms that are much less conducive to transit. So, for example, when you see Walmart sitting a quarter mile from the street behind a giant parking lot, that's classic car-oriented thinking. Public transit will not go to the door of that Walmart. It will be out on the street, and it is Walmart's decision to be a quarter mile away. But so we have to properly assign those impacts. So now what has happened in the last few decades is that there's been a scramble to try to figure out how to retrofit these newer cities for public transit. And a lot has been spent, I'm talking pre-COVID now, in the sort of 80s, 90s, aughts. A lot has been spent on new light rail systems and so on. And they've achieved a lot of things, but they're also still up against the basic fact that the layout of most of those regions, certainly the suburban parts of those regions, is just deeply, deeply incompatible with good public transit. So it is a matter of legacy. And although there are things you can do in a new city, you set your expectations accordingly.
I have never thought about it until you just mentioned it, but it is, when you go to Walmart, you go to Target, the parking lot is pretty big, and it's meant for cars. It's not meant to take a bus there.
And similar things exist in the suburbs in Europe, but they're usually oriented at 90 degrees so that one end of the building is up against the street so you can walk to it from the bus stop. That sort of simple difference is just enormous. And, that Walmart has been replicated, tens of thousands of times across the United States. It always looks pretty much the same. It's always sending a signal that, people who are not in cars are not really welcome here. And so that's the world we've built, and it will take a while to evolve away from that. And that's why, of course, car dependence seems so natural if you live in the outer suburbs where that's where things are.
But cars seem easier at times. As someone who lives in the city, when you go to the supermarket, you have to schlep everything home. A car, if you would drive up, you can't drive up to my apartment building, but if you could drive up to your house and you unload the groceries, it's much easier than taking 4 bags home and saying, oh, I can't buy this, not because I can't afford it, but I can't buy it because how am I going to get all this stuff home?
So the key thing there is helping people make smart decisions about how many cars to own. There are, of course, lots of people living in dense cities like New York where they don't own cars at all and where that's financially liberating, frankly, to not own a car because cars are very expensive to own, especially in a big city. So that's great. But then it's much more common for a family to make a decision about how many cars they need. And we want them to be able to choose to have fewer cars than they have drivers because there's usually someone in the family who can travel by another way if they need to travel. The key for low car lifestyles and no car lifestyles is that usually there is some sort of car sharing option, just short-term car rental, basically, so that if you really do need to go to Target once a month, you can do that. Or, of course, you can take Uber and Lyft to Target and, bring all your bags back at once. And if you're only going to do that once or twice a month, you probably can afford to do that. So the key to urban living without a car, especially, is really not just public transit, but all of the different alternatives that are available and cost-effective, depending on how often you're going to need them.
And so you just talked about Uber and Lyft. How is that affecting transportation today?
It had a huge effect back in the teens because, remember, Uber and Lyft came in and were immediately dramatically underpriced. So these companies had enormous amounts of venture capital, and they used that to basically intentionally lose money for many, many years. And by intentionally losing money, they offered their service at a very low price so as to get us hooked and so as to drive their competitors, the taxi companies, out of business. And also, in the course of doing that, they undermined public transit a fair bit. Lots of people who had used public transit and who could have found they could afford these discounted services switched over, at least for a while. So what we saw in New York City and in other dense cities in particular is that turned into an increase in traffic congestion because Uber and Lyft were generating more traffic than people did when they drove their cars alone to their destination. That's a really important point, and stop and think about how that works. When you drive your car to your destination, you need a parking space, but then on the other hand, the car's just going to sit there until you need it again. When you take Uber to your destination, the car then drives onward to the next job. And all that driving, the empty driving, which is as much as 50% of all of their driving time, is new vehicle miles traveled, new traffic on the streets that wasn't there before. So the easiest way to think about what Uber and Lyft do is that they reduce parking demand, but they increase congestion. And so that's not a win-win. It's a win for some points of view and a big loss for other points of view. And it's particularly bad in dense cities. And the reason why core city governments all over the U.S. have had such a fraught relationship with Uber and Lyft is not just that Uber in particular originally came in as outlaws and tried to just ignore them, but it's also more fundamentally that traveling one party per car is a wasteful use of space, and making that easier will cause people to waste space more so that we get in each other's way more, and that's what congestion is.
And now that you're talking about congestion, let's talk about congestion pricing. Do you know much about it in New York?
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar with it.
So when it started, I would say it was working. But today, downtown seems just as congested as it was 5 years ago. It doesn't seem like anything's changed. And it feels like people are just like, okay, we'll pay the $9.
But something else is happening. Transit ridership is back up substantially. Many people are not paying the $9 and using public transit instead. And what that means is that although you see the same number of cars as you did a few years ago, you are seeing much more life. You are seeing much more economic activity. You are seeing more going on with the same number of cars. So nobody wants to hear this, but there is, in fact, a difference between the level of congestion people complain about and the level they tolerate. And that difference is really important in understanding how congestion works. So you're noticing a level of congestion that you complain about. And what that means is that congestion has gotten back to the level that people tolerate, but it's not going to get worse than that. There will always be fantasies about sooner or later the whole city will just stop and we'll all be stuck in our cars. And that never happens because as congestion gets worse, more and more people choose other alternatives. And that's why congestion gets bad up to a particular point that we all agree is very bad, but never actually freezes and stops. And so the thing to remember about congestion is that you're going to complain about it at a much lower level, but then there's a different level where you're actually going to make a choice and do something different. And that's why congestion pricing controls congestion so effectively. If the people decided that there was now too much congestion and you want less, just turn the price up and congestion will go back down for a while. But eventually what will happen is that congestion will go back up to the level that people tolerate because it's only when it becomes intolerable that many people stop driving. Meanwhile, what you'll have achieved, which is harder to notice, is that more people are there doing stuff. The city is more prosperous because fewer people are in cars. See how that works?
Yeah, so that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Is building public transit a generally bipartisan goal today, or does it remain strictly split along party lines?
Well, it is inevitable that people living in dense cities are going to feel that transit is an urgent necessity because their cities can't function without it. And that people who live in outer suburban and rural areas are not going to feel that way. That's not their daily experience. If you live in an outer suburb, cars are fine. Getting around by car is fine for most of your purposes, and you may only think about transit if you need to take the train into the big city because it's too hard to drive there. So that's, I think, why it's natural that support for public transit is very strongly correlated with the density at which people live. Now, unfortunately, at the moment in America, it hasn't always been like this. Political opinions are also very strongly correlated with the density at which people live. People in lower density places like Wyoming are the most reliable Republicans. People in the highest density places like Manhattan are the most reliable Democrats. That is ultimately expressive of a stupid conversation about whether cities or rural life are better in some abstract way. They're just different. They're different cultures. They have different needs. And public transit is always going to be urgently necessary in the dense city. So that's the political problem. I wish it were not so politically polarizing. And I've certainly worked in other places and times when it wasn't, places when Republicans could win seats in the dense city and where, Democrats could win seats in rural areas. That's certainly been true in other parts of my life. And It's also been true in many other countries that I've worked in. Canada, for example, has a much weaker correlation between residential density and voting behavior than the U.S. does. So those are all interesting. And ultimately, you look at the situation and inevitably are going to feel that Democrats are your party if you want investment in this. It's not, I think, where we want to be in the long run. And I would also say, though, one other important thing, I'll sometimes make the joke about Utah. The pretty good transit system in the Salt Lake Provo-Orem region is nice evidence that when there are no Democrats to blame, Republicans will figure this out for themselves. And there you have a really good transit system for a U.S. city its size, including light rail and a pretty good commuter rail line, developed almost entirely by Republicans because that's who there is in Utah. And so it is entirely possible to bring Republicans along on this journey, but it usually has to be at the level of local politics where they are focused on solving actual problems rather than at the level of national politics where everybody is acting out a stupid culture war about whether city or rural living is best.
When you read about China or Japan, they have these amazing transportation systems. Why are we having such trouble building high-speed rails in the U.S.?
That's a deep question, and many other people are more expert on it than I am. There is a whole area of research now going on around that. It's called the Transit Cost Project. I encourage you to interview someone from there. In general terms, I think we have a few problems. We are, in our decision-making, extremely decentralized. So, for example, every project is developed locally, and there is a tendency for things to be too specialized. Many European and Asian countries are making much more centralized decisions to, buy things in quantity. There are some fundamental things wrong with the transit construction industry in the U.S. that everybody knows. The costs are completely unreasonable compared to our peers, and it is frankly one of the reasons that I enjoy getting great things done with bus service, because I just don't need to wait around for that heavy infrastructure to get built. I can go ahead and improve things for people now, which is more or less what we do in network planning. I mean, the costs are out of control. The processes are out of control. Most of these other countries have more centralized processes. Obviously, it's easier in China where there's no democracy and the bureaucrats can do what they want. But even in democracies like Japan or in most of Europe, there's a much more controlled, limited opportunity for people to complain. Also, frankly, there's a much greater government power to commandeer the space they need to really get things done. If you follow the history of California high-speed rail, just the thing went through the Central Valley, which was always only lukewarm in its support of it, and you had all these landowners and all these business interests just extorting various things they wanted. Oh, if you're going to build a train here, that means you're going to have to fix this retaining wall that's been bothering us for years. Everybody else immediately tries to figure out how that project should pay for the thing they've been wanting to do all along. And so you just get bled by all of these demands and the lawsuits and the additional problems with environmental law being weaponized against pro-environment projects, problems for which California is really the best example, but which bedevil us all over the U.S. So I think that's a rich topic.
We're talking about the Second Avenue subway system in New York. That was expensive and it took forever. And then they wanted to put a train in between New Jersey and New York.
Huge.
It becomes huge and it becomes political.
And, in big cities like New York especially, you get a lot of monumentalism. You get politicians wanting things to be big and dramatic and beautiful so that they'll be able to take credit for them. I mean, when you use the new segments of the Second Avenue subway on the Upper East Side, they're very, very nice. But did they really need those mezzanines? An entire level of the station? We all know that many New York subway stations get by fine without that. You just know you have to go in one entrance for the southbound train and the different entrance for the northbound train. It's not the end of the world that you have to do that. And yet, the stations are so much deeper and, which actually slows down everyone's trips. They have to go deeper to get to the train just because of those mezzanines. So those are the kinds of things we have to question now. We have to question why we're gold plating these projects so much when the result is that we just don't get enough transit built.
And we touched a little bit about this, but how heavily is the reality of climate change driving cars and cities and public transportation?
I think that The biggest challenges for public transit right now are the electrification mandates, the zero emission mandates that have been put on transit by particularly many well-intentioned blue states, but above all, California. It made all the sense in the world to a lot of legislators who don't use transit much or who don't think very much about it, that yes, we ought to start by decarbonizing our fleets, and we can start with the transit agencies because we control that. So let's go and make the transit agencies buy zero emission buses. And the problem with that as a mandate is that it does several terrible things to transit agencies. First of all, it requires them to buy version 1 of a technology, which is probably going to be disappointing. And the transit industry has had that experience with early electric buses, including one bus manufacturer, Proterra, who went bankrupt and has now left useless lemons that no one will maintain. Then we have the problem that the enormous cost and focus that is going into zero emissions is happening instead of providing better service. And so we're getting cleaner buses, but fewer buses is the trade-off. Now, that is actually a bad deal for the climate because more buses providing more useful service to more people, getting more people out of cars is better for the climate, even if those buses have some emissions. And the insistence in California that no, the buses have to be zero emission, absolute zero, has really been a huge, huge problem for the transit agencies there. And transit managers there mostly understand that it's out of control and not leading them in a good place. Because at the same time that these mandates are sitting there, transit agencies are facing these fiscal crises that are requiring them to cut service dramatically, but they have to keep their zero emission program going because that's the law. So some of those things are really unhelpful.
I ask this of all my interviews now because AI plays such a vital role in our world. How is AI playing a role in transportation?
It has some obvious uses. AI is generally a good way to automate a lot of analysis tasks. It has interesting potential for automating a lot of communications and communicating with people in ways that are more natural for them. I think there's plenty of applications for it. I am a skeptic on many aspects of AI. In our work, we have to communicate by writing, and I will not let AI write anything that gets published in our firm's name. We won't do it because people recognize and can sense when they are communicating with a person. And when they are here, and, as somebody famously said, why should I take the time to read something that nobody would take the time to write? So
I made an appointment the other day with my dermatologist, and then all of a sudden I realized it was a computer.
Mhm.
And I don't want to
and,
make I don't
we
want to make an appointment with a computer. I want to talk to a person.
I know, and to a degree, we'll probably resign ourselves to some of that. Most of us don't talk to airline ticket agents anymore either because the websites are good enough for most purposes. We've accepted a certain amount of that, but I think there's also a deep level of rebellion. I think an interesting related issue coming up in the public transit space is, trains, of course, can already be driverless. They've been driverless in Vancouver, Canada for more than 40 years as of this year. So that's an old technology. Now there's a lot of talk about whether buses could ever be driverless. And it just raises a really interesting, complex set of issues about what people really need out of that experience, how important it is to have a human being there. Interesting stuff.
I think you need a human being on the bus. I mean, I'm not sure about the train, but on the bus, I think you would want someone to see who's there.
They had all these debates about the driverless train. And what people quickly discovered is that if somebody is misbehaving on a train, the driver is several hundred feet away at the other end of the train. It's actually better that you can push a button and alert central control who can do whatever they need to do about your situation. So it's of course different with buses, but as buses get larger, like the articulated hinged buses that you see a lot in New York, it becomes more like a train, and you start asking, what can you really expect the bus driver to do about something that's happening in the back of his bus? Maybe it is better to have more cameras, more monitoring, and the ability for anyone to push a button or send a text and get attention.
And then you seem so passionate about transportation. How did you get involved in transportation?
Yeah, sure. When I was in fourth grade, so about age 10, we lived on one side of Portland and my school was on the other side, and my hippie parents weren't particularly interested in providing my transportation. I started taking the city buses across the city to school, and then I found that I was really interested in that and really enjoyed the thinking about geographic systems. And so that's what got me into it. I've done a bunch of other things. I got a PhD in a literature field on the way. I'm interested in too many things, but feel good about having, come back to this and having had this career really bringing all those different skills together in trying to make transit systems better.
Since you brought up literature, what's your favorite book?
Don't ask a literature scholar about their favorite book. That's a what's your favorite child kind of question. You don't want to ask me that.
Okay. And as we wrap up, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
I think the most important thing I'd like people to remember about public transit is that right now we are giving our public transit agencies contradictory expectations. If you listen to what people are asking transit agencies for, it's like telling your taxi driver to turn right and left at the same time. Because on the one hand, we're constantly judging them based on ridership, but on the other hand, we're constantly telling them to do low ridership things like provide this or that service because someone really needs it, not because there'll be lots of people riding it. So in my book, Human Transit, which I encourage people to pick up if they're all curious about this, it's very friendly and readable. I spend quite a bit of time on what we call that trade-off between ridership goals and other goals, because one of the ways that people are most being misinformed by most of the media coverage is they're getting the impression that transit is trying to maximize its ridership and failing, when in fact ridership is what it is because transit is trying to do lots of different things, and that's only one of them.
You bring that point up, and I've never thought of it in that way. So I think they're trying to do too many things at once.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of our work then, when we come in and do a network design, the first thing we need to do is work with their decision makers and get clarity about what the goal actually is. Because the goal is usually confused when we arrive and in need of clarification.
Jarrett Walker, thank you so much for joining me. The blog is Human Transit. The book is also Human Transit. Let me know what you think. Put your thoughts in the comment section. As always, thank you also for listening. And until next time, everyone, be safe.